We're going to talk today about a couple of things that might surprise you about World War II, a war many of us lived through or remember clearly. It's a story of arrogance versus ingenuity, played out in the deadly thin air high above Europe. You see, most people believe the air war was decided by flak and fast fighters, but history suggests the real enemy was far colder and far quieter. The Germans, with their characteristic focus on complex engineering, ridiculed a piece of American equipment on our B-17 flying fortresses. They saw weakness where we had designed a quiet, robust strength. We're talking about a difference in philosophy that ultimately cost them dearly and saved thousands of American boys. That core contrast, German technological fixation versus American pragmatic resolution, is what we need to unpack. But first, let's go back to the skies of 1943. What if I told you the single biggest threat to a B-17 on a long-range mission wasn't a Messerschmitt, but a phenomenon you couldn't shoot down? The promise of the flying fortress was right there in the name, that our bombers, flying high at 25,000 feet, were impervious to attack. We built them tough. They could take incredible punishment and bring the boys home. But there was a silent, relentless enemy waiting at those high altitudes, and it was far more lethal than any enemy ace. This enemy was structural icing. It was the ice hammer of 40,000 feet. Imagine flying a truck made of aluminum into a deep freeze. Now imagine frost accumulating on your windshield, but it's covering your entire wing, changing its shape. It steals lift inch by agonizing inch. The danger was immediate, and the problem was simple, yet unsolved. Ice builds fast, and it doesn't give you a second chance. The men knew it. Many veteran crews in the 8th Air Force often shared the same grim preference. They'd rather face the worst barrage of flak over Schweinfurt than fly through a sustained run of clear icing conditions. If you think that's an exaggeration, you don't fully appreciate how quickly a B-17, that beautiful symbol of American industrial might, could become a tumbling coffin. Now, let's look at the two sides of the technological coin. The Germans, they had their radar altimeter. This was a precise piece of equipment, allowing pilots to know their exact height above the ground, not just sea level, which was a great military advancement. They prided themselves on that surgical precision. But the Americans, our B-17s, they had a more basic, older-style barometric altimeter. It was reliable, but it was nowhere near as precise as the German tech. This is where the story turns. When German intelligence studied captured B-17s, they openly scoffed at our outdated altimeters. They saw it as proof of American backwardness, proof of their own technological superiority. Therefore, they missed the bigger picture entirely. They were focused on knowing the precise altitude, but the Americans were focused on achieving airworthiness, making sure the plane could fly at all in those deadly conditions. History suggests the problem of structural icing cost the 8th Air Force nearly 10% of total bomber losses in key periods, according to many analyses of the time. This was a steady, predictable loss that fighters alone couldn't claim credit for. And that overwhelming systemic problem of icing is exactly what the German technological pride blinded them to. They saw a weakness in the instrument panel, and they mocked it, but they failed to see the fatal flaw in their own strategic focus. If you're nodding your head, recognizing that timeless lesson about arrogance and oversight, then please consider hitting the subscribe button. We build these stories not just to remember the past, but to ensure the wisdom stays alive for the future. We had a desperate need for a solution that would solve the real problem, not the intellectual exercise of perfect altitude. That necessity led to a simple, brilliant piece of American ingenuity that those German scientists never saw coming: the Electro-Thermal De-Icer. Therefore, the German focus on altitude precision in the thin air was a costly obsession, because the real life-and-death struggle lay in beating the ice that built up around that thin air. The promise of the B-17, that majestic flying fortress, was that its sheer altitude and incredible durability made it nearly untouchable. But many of us who remember those days know the truth. The air itself often presented a more terrifying and certainly more relentless threat than any German fighter squadron. We need to understand the true nature of the challenge facing those brave young men. The unseen enemy they fought daily wasn't the human element. It was the physics of structural icing. Ask any veteran bomber crewman, and many would tell you that on certain missions, the worry about the icebox, the supercooled layers of atmosphere, overshadowed the worry about flak or the Luftwaffe. Now, how could something so simple be considered deadlier than a shell exploding next to your wing? The answer lies in the nature of the accumulation. This wasn't a matter of slow frost. This was the formation of rime ice and clear ice, the latter being the most lethal. Imagine a simple household problem. Your wings are meticulously designed to slice through the air and create lift. Now, picture taking that beautifully engineered wing, that airfoil, and rapidly gluing rough, dense plastic to its leading edge. That's essentially what ice did. Rime ice, formed by tiny supercooled water droplets, was rough and milky. It caused lift to fall off dramatically, but the clear ice, formed by larger droplets in slightly warmer air layers, was a genuine terror. It could build up as dense as a sheet of window glass, distorting the wing's shape, or airfoil, until it completely lost its ability to generate lift. It was also heavy. The drag on the aircraft increased exponentially, and the accumulation could occur in minutes. The psychological pressure on the flight crew was immense. They're up there trying to hold formation, trying to navigate, and knowing that at any moment, the very air around them could turn their machine into a leaden brick. Many crews who aborted missions didn't do so because of flak damage. They did so because the plane simply wouldn't climb, or the controls began to feel mushy and unresponsive. Losing that feeling of control, that subtle feedback through the yoke, was often the last signal before disaster. So why was ice so often overlooked by the high command in early planning? Because it was unpredictable, and unlike the fighters, it didn't leave wreckage traceable back to a clear enemy engagement. The reports simply read, "lost due to weather," obscuring the true technological problem. According to records from the early years of the war, when the fight over the European theater was most intense, non-combat losses, a category heavily skewed by icing, accounted for nearly half of all bomber losses on some of the longest, deepest missions. That's a staggering and often forgotten statistic. The existing solutions, like the clumsy pneumatic boots on the leading edges, were inadequate. This was the initial American fix: rubber tubes glued to the wing that you'd inflate and deflate in a cycle. This process, however, was designed to crack the ice off after it had already accumulated. But in clear icing conditions, the system was slow, consumed critical engine power, and often failed at the extreme cold required. The ice would build faster than the boots could cycle. The Germans, meanwhile, were focused on their own technological obsessions, but the German strategic view was flawed because they weren't focused on airworthiness, they were entirely focused on precision and intercept. While our boys were wrestling with control yokes encased in ice, the Germans were refining their radar altimeter. They saw it as the ultimate expression of control, knowing your precise clearance above the ground, down to the foot. Therefore, the ridicule they poured onto our simpler American barometric altimeter wasn't just arrogance. It was a symptom of a deeper strategic blind spot. They missed the fundamental life-or-death problem of flying high for extended periods because they were obsessed with a marginal gain in navigational precision. If you're finding the hidden history behind these technological duels compelling, give this video a thumbs up. It helps other folks who value these deep dives find the content, and it lets us know we should keep digging for more stories like this. The German priority was dogfighting and ground-level approach precision. They never had to solve the problem of keeping large bomber fleets alive for 8 to 10 hours in the upper atmosphere. This is the classic oversight of focusing on the tactics of a sword fight when you should be worrying about the foundation of the bridge you're fighting on. They were optimizing for the engagement, while we were optimizing for the journey. The German technological fix, the Radar Altimeter, was truly a brilliant piece of engineering. However, in the extreme conditions of the ETO, it was the wrong solution to the wrong problem. Therefore, we must now examine exactly how the Germans developed this superior yet flawed technology, and why their overconfidence in this radar precision became the costly trap that ultimately sealed their fate in the air war. We left off realizing that structural icing was the real silent killer over the European theater. The American focus was on airworthiness, but the Germans, they were chasing perfection. They had developed a piece of equipment that truly was technologically superior at the time, and it was this pride that became their downfall. So how did a technology that worked perfectly, that delivered a genuine performance edge, become a strategic liability for the Luftwaffe? The core of their technical brilliance was the radar altimeter, known as the FUG-10-1. Most standard altimeters, including the barometric one in the early B-17, measured the aircraft's height above sea level. The principle is simple. It measures atmospheric pressure, and the lower the pressure, the higher the altitude. But if you're flying over mountains or a deep valley, your true clearance above the ground can be dangerously misleading.
The German FUG-101 solved that problem elegantly. It used radio waves, bouncing them off the terrain directly beneath the aircraft. This gave the pilot a precise, true reading of the ground clearance, regardless of the topography. Imagine flying low over the North Sea in heavy fog. That precision could mean the difference between a successful coastal raid and flying straight into the water. This was genuinely advanced technology for the early 1940s, a testament to German engineering prowess. Therefore, when they captured an intact B-17 and examined its cockpit, their reaction was swift and dismissive. This is the critical narrative beat of the whole war. They looked at our equipment and saw a relic, the simple older barometric altimeter. They openly scoffed. The reports from German intelligence at the time often asked, why the primitive apparatus? They concluded that the Americans were technologically lagging, missing a fundamental element of modern flight control. They saw an easy mark, a sign of weakness, but they were blinded by their own achievement. Their fixation on the FUG-101, knowing your altitude down to the exact foot, was a strategic error because it misidentified the primary problem. They were optimizing for a navigational challenge when the overwhelming strategic challenge was one of survival. It's the equivalent of demanding a gold-plated compass on a ship that's constantly taking on water. The German High Command allowed their technological achievement to foster a dangerous arrogance, a belief that complex, specialized solutions always trump simple, robust ones. Many veterans of that era will tell you that reliable simplicity is the greatest trait a piece of kit can possess. Therefore, because they were so focused on the precision of the radar altimeter, they directed their R&D resources toward improving navigational control rather than tackling the more fundamental problem of airframe endurance. They focused on how to make the plane more effective in combat, not how to keep it alive for the long haul in the high, cold air. The consequence of this focus was a massive strategic blind spot that we need to understand fully. The Luftwaffe was built and trained primarily for two tasks: rapid close air support and short-range, high-intensity interception of enemy formations. Their operational experience rarely involved the long-haul, deep-penetration bombing missions that characterized the American effort. This meant they had never been forced to develop or adopt the robust heavy-duty anti-icing equipment that the B-17 desperately needed. When we, the Americans, realized our initial anti-icing rubber boots weren't cutting it, we poured resources into a better solution, a necessity born of our commitment to persistent, deep-strike bombing. The Germans, however, simply never saw the need. They believed the B-17s could be stopped before icing became a universal problem. If this analysis of wartime technology gives you a new perspective on history, consider sharing this video. There are a lot of great men out there who appreciate a deep, honest look at these historical turning points. The trap was subtle. The FUG-101 was excellent technology, but its existence affirmed a flawed strategy. The Germans had a superior altimeter, but we had a superior philosophy of war-winning endurance. They felt safe in their technical superiority, not realizing they were neglecting the most essential challenge of high-altitude flight. This arrogant confidence in their own complex solution allowed the ice hammer of 40,000 feet to continue its grim work against the Americans, unchecked and unchallenged by German R&D. But the tide was about to turn. But that arrogant confidence would soon crash headlong into American pragmatism. Therefore, we must now examine the simple, elegant, and ultimately war-winning solution the Americans deployed, a technology that solved the problem they actually had, ensuring the flying fortress kept flying when physics demanded it fall. The German High Command, as we discussed, was busy admiring its own technological reflection in the form of the radar altimeter. They missed the truth. The war would be won not by precision but by endurance. The fundamental challenge of the high-altitude war was simply staying up there, fighting the ice hammer of 40,000 feet. This is where the American engineering philosophy shines through. It's the simple, enduring principle many of us understand: the best technology is the one that keeps the machine running, not the one that looks flashiest on the drawing board. Our initial solution, the rubber de-icing boots, had failed in sustained, clear icing conditions. A new solution was needed urgently, and it needed to be foolproof. The very core of the American strategic effort, the persistent day and night bombing of the Nazi war machine, depended on solving this one basic engineering problem. If the B-17s couldn't fly in all weather, the entire air offensive would grind to a frustrating halt. The early systems, developed before the war, relied on exhaust heat, a kind of crude hot air distribution that proved unreliable, inefficient, and often failed at the exact moment crews needed it most. You simply couldn't divert enough precious engine heat across the vast, freezing surfaces of a bomber wing to get the job done quickly. This inability was a major cause for those early, devastating non-combat losses. Therefore, the engineers had to stop thinking about using wasted heat and start thinking about applying controlled, targeted heat. The ultimate, war-winning answer was elegantly simple, and it was a direct descendant of the urgency facing the B-17, the Electro-Thermal De-Icer. This system was a radical departure. Instead of inflating rubber boots or pumping lukewarm air, engineers designed electrically heated heating pads that were physically built into the leading edges of the wings and tail stabilizers. They were tough, thin mats laced with high-resistance wires. The principle was ingenious. You weren't trying to melt the entire layer of ice. You only needed to melt the thin, delicate layer of ice bonded right next to the metal. Once that thin layer of bond was broken, the incredible force of the slipstream, the air rushing over the wing at hundreds of miles per hour, could do the rest. It would simply rip the larger chunk of ice off the wing and carry it away. This instantaneous release was the key to maintaining a clean airfoil. This new system didn't require complex pneumatics or diverting engine power. It needed electricity, which the B-17's generators could reliably provide. It was a robust, simple fix to a complex existential problem. If you appreciate a tool that simply works when your back is against the wall, this was it.
But the engineering breakthrough was only half the battle. Therefore, the truly decisive factor was the American capability to manufacture and rapidly install this technology across the entire fleet. While the Germans were still arguing about the merits of their new radar altimeter in the lab, American factories were performing an industrial miracle. They had to produce tens of thousands of these intricate heating elements, integrating them perfectly into complex aluminum airframes. This demonstrated a profound strategic advantage that no amount of precision navigation could counter: the ability to quickly iterate and implement a pragmatic battlefield solution at massive scale. The retrofit program was relentless, pushing the de-icers onto new planes rolling off the assembly line and into older planes in maintenance depots.
The B-17, now equipped with the Electro-Thermal De-Icer, transformed from a fair-weather bomber into a true all-weather weapon. This ability to commit to missions regardless of icing conditions was the single greatest factor in maintaining the relentless air offensive. The Germans were focused on the tactics of interception, but we were focused on the relentless flow of the war. If this story gives you a new appreciation for the ingenuity of the greatest generation, take a moment to subscribe. We're committed to sharing these overlooked stories of sacrifice and engineering brilliance. The duel wasn't between the Fug 101 and the barometric altimeter. It was between the precise, sophisticated German radar altimeter that offered marginal gain and the simple, durable American Electro-Thermal De-Icer that offered a virtual guarantee of life. The difference was in priority. The Germans prioritized precision and information. The Americans prioritized airworthiness and survival. Therefore, the widespread adoption of those hot wires didn't just save thousands of crews, it fundamentally changed the nature of the strategic air war, proving that reliability and endurance could defeat even the most focused technological arrogance. American necessity that birthed the Electro-Thermal De-Icer. Now we arrive at the culmination of this technological duel, the point where American pragmatism delivered a decisive, war-winning blow against the German strategic plan. The moment of truth wasn't a sudden climactic battle. It was the quiet, overwhelming realization in the German high command that they could no longer stop the B-17s from flying. The true effectiveness of a simple solution isn't just what it fixes, but what it enables. The widespread adoption of those hot wires across the entire American bomber fleet didn't just marginally improve safety. It fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of the European theater. It turned the B-17 from a heavy-casualty, fair-weather bomber into a genuine, relentless, all-weather weapon. Imagine trying to fight a 4-round boxing match, but your opponent suddenly gains the ability to fight 10 rounds. That's the strategic advantage the Electro-Thermal De-Icer gave the 8th Air Force. It allowed them to maintain constant, unrelenting pressure on Germany's vital industrial and transport networks, regardless of the brutal upper atmosphere conditions. But this wasn't a visible advantage that the Germans could bomb or shoot down. Therefore, the German high command was slow to recognize that their entire defense strategy had been invalidated. The German failure wasn't in creating great technology. It was in prioritizing the wrong problem. While our B-17 crews could flip a switch, activating the heating pads and relying on the principle of the slipstream to cleanly shear the ice away, German air strategists were still focused on enhancing the intercept capabilities of their fighters, hoping for a tactical victory. For the pilots, the difference was profound. Many accounts from B-17 crew members of the time speak less of the technical specs and more of the sheer psychological comfort the system provided. Knowing that you could punch through a dangerous cloud layer, activate the hot wires, and hear the ice crackle and release was a life-or-death difference that translated directly into increased crew confidence and mission effectiveness. If the enduring wisdom of simple, effective solutions resonates with you, let me know in the comments. We value hearing your own recollections and perspectives on these wartime lessons. The Germans, relying on the precision of the Fug 101, thought they had an edge in navigation. However, the reality was that they had created a fatal technological distraction.
Their arrogance meant they never dedicated the vast industrial and research effort required to counter the B-17's newfound airworthiness. The sheer cost of building and deploying the Electro-Thermal De-Icer demonstrated American industrial might. It required complex, precise electrical heating elements to be manufactured and installed on a mass scale, a clear capability that Germany, already suffering from intense bombing, simply could not match or replicate for their own aircraft. Therefore, the simple solution became the complex strategic problem for the enemy. This entire episode is a stark, eternal lesson in prioritization. When the stakes are high, you must invest resources in solving the actual systemic bottleneck. The Germans focused on perfecting altitude information, which was merely a marginal convenience. The Americans focused on airframe survival, which was the absolute non-negotiable requirement for the entire mission. They had precise information about where they were. We had reliable assurance that we would get there. In the brutal calculus of a world war, reliability wins every time over novelty. The legacy of the B-17's de-icer isn't just about saving planes. It's about validating a philosophy that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. It cemented the B-17's role as the unstoppable flying fortress and decided the air war not with a bang, but with a silent, steady persistence. We've explored the cold, hard facts of the high-altitude war and uncovered a truth many historians often overlook. The German focus on novelty became a strategic trap, while the American drive for reliable airworthiness became the war-winning advantage. Let's be clear about the philosophical contrast one last time. The German engineers, basking in the perceived superiority of the Radar Altimeter, Fug 101, ridiculed the simple, proven barometric altimeter in the B-17. They prioritized a marginal gain in precision information. The Americans, by contrast, focused fiercely on airframe survival, pouring their genius into the Electro-Thermal De-Icer. They prioritized the absolute non-negotiable, keeping the plane airborne.
This entire episode is a stark, eternal lesson that applies to every endeavor, whether building a life, a career, or running a business. The best solution is the one that solves the most serious problem, not the one that generates the most sophisticated data. The war wasn't won by a radar altimeter's precision. It was won by the humble heating element's resilience. The Germans missed the forest for the trees, optimizing for the beauty of their technology while neglecting the foundational safety of their pilots. History reminds us that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And that wisdom is what endures. When you are facing a massive challenge in life, the equivalent of an ice hammer threatening your livelihood, don't get distracted by the bells and whistles. Focus your resources on the foundational systems that guarantee successful completion. Focus on the engine, not the expensive dashboard accessory. If this deep dive into historical ingenuity and strategic foresight resonated with your own hard-earned wisdom, the kind of wisdom that comes from years of experience, please take a moment to click that like button below. That small click is the way you let us know that these stories still hold valuable lessons for your generation. We remember the B-17 as the flying fortress, a symbol of American resilience and industrial might. Its true strength wasn't just its armor or its guns, but its capacity for pragmatic adaptation. It was a platform that accepted and implemented reliable, simple improvements, like the De-Icer, that collectively turned it into the war-winning weapon history remembers. The ultimate truth of the great technological duel is that reliability and endurance defeat novelty and arrogance. The side that prioritized their people's safety and the mission's core requirements ultimately dictated the terms of the air war. All the related videos and further reading materials on these W2 innovations are easy to find. Just check the description below for clear links. We'll continue exploring the quiet victories and overlooked lessons of the greatest generation. The technology may be gone, but the wisdom remains, and it's always worth sharing.